Well, good morning, everyone. Is the mic okay? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you to the organizers of this event for having me. Thanks to the Center for Law and Human Behavior at University of Texas, El Paso. Thank you very much to Chief Manjarrez and to Dr. Sanchez for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out this morning. It's such a delight to be here to share the work that me and my colleagues at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime have been working on for several years now. And I'll echo the sentiments of Luigi. It's a real opportunity and a real pleasure to be here in front of law enforcement and practitioners, because so often when I'm sharing my work with people, it's either with policymakers that are working on a very political level, or academics, or kind of just general interest audiences, but never people who have the expertise and experiences that you do. So I very much look forward to your questions, and I look forward to learning a lot from you during these coffee breaks and lunches. So thanks again for having me. This presentation is going to focus on the changing political economies of migrant smuggling networks in Africa, and the new challenges and new risks that they pose for a broad range of actors. Some of it will overlap with what Luigi has already told you, so I might actually deviate a bit from the slides just to avoid some repetition, and maybe to offer some different insights that also kind of came up with the Q&A during Luigi's session. There are some things there that I think I can build on, and please don't hesitate to ask for any clarifications or raise your hand in the middle of my presentation if you have any questions. So, just a quick introduction to the research that we're doing at the Global Initiative. This particular project and the reports we've been writing on this, and actually, if I can be shameless enough, a book that I just wrote, that just came out, written by me and my colleague Tuesday Retano, called Migrant, Refugee, Smuggler, Savior, available in all good bookstores as of yesterday in the US, is the research that we've been working on is based on interviews in West Africa, East Africa, the Horn of Africa, I guess I have East Africa up there twice, Yemen, Turkey, and Europe from 2012 to 2016. So it's been ongoing research that's taken a bunch of different forms, but really traces back to 2012. And the analysis that we've been working on, or one of the points of analysis we've been working on, is the market dynamics and the actors involved. So understanding migrant smuggling within the broader context of the political economies in which they take place. And then the next step, it's one thing to constantly just be analyzing the what's going on the ground, and as a journalist myself, that's usually what I focus on. But at a certain point, policymakers want to know what's to be done, what can we do what policies can we pursue to ameliorate what's being called this migration crisis in Europe. So I'll start with actually a very, well, before I get into definitions of what a smuggler is, let me just clarify that I'm going to give an overview of the three basic kind of, shall I say, hubs or smuggling systems that are operating in Africa right now. And these are the systems that are funneling people, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa into Europe. I hope to offer some insight regarding really how European and policies by European governments, as well as African governments, I believe has created an environment that's actually accelerated the development of a robust and expanding migrant smuggling industry. And furthermore, I think a lot of the efforts to combat migrant smuggling have proved counterproductive, mainly because they actually don't address the underlying issues that fuel demand for smuggler services. And so as a result, what we've had is a product of many of the policies being pursued is actually an increase in human insecurity along these migrant smuggling routes, and it actually empowers criminal organizations, yet at the same time hasn't really done that much to reduce migrant flows. And so if policymakers are going to adequately address this current, again, I'll call it, I tend to put crisis in quotes, by engaging the migrant smuggling networks, then there actually needs to be a pretty sophisticated understanding of how they function and how they evolve, because the wrong type of intervention can actually have a lot of negative repercussions that actually make the problem worse or create new sets of challenges. So let me offer just a very quick note on language. During this presentation, I'm going to use the word migrant pretty broadly. Obviously, within that subset of people who are migrating, there are refugees and asylum seekers who, because they are refugees and asylum seekers fleeing conflict or political persecution, qualify for a very specific set of protections under international law. Of course, many of the people moving are also just economic migrants who wouldn't qualify for these protections. But when I use the term migrant, so if I use the term Syrian migrant, not that, don't interpret that as me saying that that individual or that hypothetical person shouldn't be afforded refugee rights. So very quickly, what is migrant smuggling? What is the crime of migrant smuggling that we're talking about? Well, it's actually defined in international law according to the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention. Migrant smuggling is, quote, the procurement in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit of the illegal entry of a person into a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident. Now, put into more comprehensible English, that really means migrant smuggling is when someone enters into a transactional relationship with another person to help them enter a country irregularly or illegally, so outside the formal and official channels of entering a country. And it's actually quite important to differentiate between migrant smuggling and human trafficking. The terms are often used interchangeably and can often be conflated, but again, according to international law, it's defined quite differently. There's a separate convention on that, and human trafficking is the recruitment or transportation or transfer or harboring of a receipt of a person by means that use coercion. So it can be an abduction, it can be through fraud or deception, but it's a fundamentally different crime, at least in theory, than migrant smuggling, because human trafficking is not a willing buyer, willing seller scenario. It's not a consensual arrangement. The person being trafficked is being exploited and being moved against their will. And these are what we think of when we think of unpaid labor, debt bondage, forced prostitution, trafficking of women, trafficking of children. It's a different crime from migrant smuggling. Now, the line between the two can often blur, and sometimes people who enter into an arrangement that they think in which they're being smuggled, it turns out they're actually being trafficked, or even throughout an entire journey from phase one to the final step, at some point the relationship between the smuggler and the client, the migrant, might actually change and no longer really resemble smuggling and resemble something more like trafficking. And I'll give some more specific examples of that later, but one of the areas where we're really seeing this blur is along one of the routes in East Africa, where almost as part of the migrant smuggling economy has come this expectation that if you're a migrant who hires a smuggler to move you through Sudan on the way to Libya, somewhere along the way in Sudan, your smuggler, who again you've paid to provide a service, may stop the trip or hold you somewhere and expect you to call family members or parents saying that a ransom needs to be paid, otherwise something very bad is going to happen to you. And then once that ransom gets paid, the smuggler services actually continue. So there's kind of this hybrid model of smuggling and providing a service, yet also exploiting your client. But before we get into all of that, what is a smuggler? Broadly speaking, a smuggler is anyone who helps a migrant overcome a boundary or a barrier to enter a country through, like I said, illegal or irregular channels. So these barriers can be geographic, and they can be physical in the form of a desert or a sea or a giant border fence, or they can be political in the form of a policy such as a visa restriction, and they can also be cultural. In fact, sometimes people hire a smuggler not because they need them to physically pass through the territory, but because they might have a cultural, they might not have the language skills to get through an area safely, or they might have a certain physical profile for which it's dangerous for them to be in that area, or belong to a certain religion, and so they will hire someone who can navigate all of those potential pitfalls to move them through the country, even though technically they could probably do so legally, but they're paying for smuggler services. And I think as we think about all these types of borders and barriers and boundaries that people are paying other people to overcome, I think one of the biggest takeaways we need to understand is that smugglers don't create their markets. They are the supply to someone else's demand. And actually, demand for smuggler services are reaching unprecedented levels, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that we're living in an era of unprecedented displacement. So some estimates, as many as 60 million people worldwide are displaced. 16 to 20 million of those are refugees, or so people who've been displaced outside of their country. And there's really only three ways, according to international law, that someone who's a refugee can stop being a refugee. One is to go home, to be returned home. And increasingly we're seeing that's just not a viable option. So it's just not viable for a Syrian who's been displaced to go back to Syria right now. That's just one example, but all over the globe there are people who've been displaced by conflict or war or famine or political persecution for whom returning home isn't an option. So that option of making someone no longer a refugee is increasingly not on the table. The second option is to be integrated in the place where they've sought refuge, or to where they've been displaced. And increasingly, again, we're seeing populations, large amounts of people, millions of people who have had to flee their home, and the place where they fled to won't accept them, or is requiring them to live in a certain arrangement that's really untenable. So in, let's say, Kenya, for example, where we have 300,000 Somali refugees who fled to the Dadaab refugee camp, their movement's incredibly limited. The ways in which they are and aren't allowed to leave the camp are heavily restricted. And we've got people now there who are the third generation to grow up in that camp. For them, there really is no end in sight. And the options are so limited that one might think, well, that's just one example. And so because there's no other alternatives, many people are relying on the third alternative, which is third country resettlement. And again, so this is what we think of when we think of the refugees that the US is usually taking in. They're not people who have fled directly to the US. They're people who have been in a refugee camp or have been displaced and applied through a process that can take several years. And as I'm sure the people in this room know, lots of vetting. And at the end of that process, they then are granted asylum status in a third country. Very few countries are even participating in that. Only a fraction of refugees in the world will ever actually be granted third country asylum. So if you're in this situation, what are you going to do? You're going to potentially decide to take matters into your own hands. You've said, the international community has failed me, the structures in place that are there to protect me, the conventions that countries have signed on to, no one is living up to these obligations. So in order to take matters into your own hands, you need the services of a smuggler. And that's in part why we see this development of these robust migrant smuggling networks. We're living in a time of unprecedented demand for smuggler services, and an entire range of actors are coalescing around that demand to provide these services. Building off of, I think, what Luigi touched on, so I'll go through this just very quickly. There's more or less two typologies of migrant smuggling packages that you can get. And so one is the pay-as-you-go model, and the other is the full package model. Pay-as-you-go is often migrants who are literally paying at each step of the journey. They don't necessarily know how they'll get from point A to point B, and how long it will take, but they're going to seek the services of a smuggler who can just take them to the next leg in the journey. The full package schemes are more sophisticated. So this might be someone who you actually pay a smuggler to procure fake documents, plane tickets. These are often the bespoke packages in which, let's say you're an Eritrean who has fled Eritrea and you are living in Sudan. You pay a smuggler who can actually get you a fake passport and plane tickets, and so you can fly directly into Germany where you'll seek asylum. Or this person might take you a different route, but they will actually oversee your entire journey. They will say, from point A to point B, in exchange for this amount of money, I'm going to facilitate getting you around all the barriers and borders you might encounter. And just to reiterate again, it's not smugglers in general who are generating this demand. The demand already exists. Now, there are some examples we can go into maybe during Q&A about examples where we are seeing smugglers potentially generating demand. But at the end of the day, it's migrants who seek smuggler services, not smugglers who are actively seeking migrants, aside from advertising their services. So as we think about these two typologies and think about the networks involved, when we're talking about smuggling from Africa into Europe, and Luigi already mentioned sort of this area right here where we have the central Mediterranean route. So this is where people are getting on boats to go to Italy, leaving mostly from Libya and to a lesser extent from Egypt to try to reach Italy. There's a vast network of migrant smugglers who are facilitating these flows. And so the three kind of systems that we've identified and think are useful to analyze in this way are the East African system and the Horn of Africa system, so down here, the Sahel system, which we're calling right here, and then the Mediterranean coast system, which is up here. Now, just to clarify, so the Sahara Desert would run right along this area, and then just below it is a strip of land, an ecosystem that goes all the way across the African continent that is referred to as the Sahel, and that's why we say the Sahel system. So there's and the Sahel is more or less where the desert ends and sub-Saharan Africa begins, just for that frame of reference. So before I get into actually going into some of the nitty-gritty of these systems, I'd like to just take a minute, and this actually deviates a little bit from the slides you've been presented, and just talk a little bit about how prices are set. So because we are talking about a supply and demand economy, it's really market forces that drive the prices that migrants pay. So prices are set by the market, where a barrier that needs to be overcome is incredibly low. There's obviously lower entry into the migrant smuggling market, so prices will be lower. The amount of expertise that's necessary is not particularly complicated. More actors can get in on the business. Where there's higher barriers and the barrier that people are trying to overcome is more complicated, whether it be a really sophisticated wall or a sea or a desert, there's only a certain amount of actors who can actually provide smuggler services. And so they can afford to charge more. So the demand stays the same, people still want to move, but the supply, the amount of smugglers who can actually provide the service, diminishes, which means prices will go up. And it also means there's, in theory, fewer migrants who can afford these smuggling services, although, as we've seen, migrant communities and people who are desperate to move will be quite resourceful in finding ways to fund their journey. So prices are therefore set by the basic rules of supply and demand. Smugglers can charge more where the barrier and that migrants are trying to overcome is more challenging, and where it requires more specialized skill. And what we see then is when borders do go up, or when when there is a crackdown on smuggler services, and when governments take action to make these types of movements more difficult, it pushes out actually the lower level entrepreneurs out of the market. So someone who just got in on migrant smuggling just to make a buck because it was easy can no longer has the criminal expertise. So they get pushed out, and what happens is the most skilled actors move in, people who already have the requisite criminal expertise. So in some circumstances, what you might actually see is because of greater law enforcement efforts or border security efforts, you can have the adverse effect of actually providing incentives for organized crime to move in. And so people who might previously not been involved in migrant smuggling because it wasn't really their core business, who were involved in things like weapon smuggling or narcotics trafficking, might actually be the only ones who can provide smuggler services, and they get in on it. And then we actually have a different criminal element with which we're dealing with from a policy perspective. So one example I'll give, I believe in the slides I started with the Horn of Africa system, but I'm actually going to start with the Sahel system, which I think really illustrates the policy challenge that we have here when we think about how to counter migrant smuggling networks in a way that actually doesn't make the problem worse. So this town right here, Agadez, in Niger is an enormous migrant smuggling hub. Again, the Sahara kind of ends, Agadez is right on the lower half of the Sahara, so it's where sub-Saharan Africa ends and the Sahara begins. And almost every migrant who goes to Libya for passage to Europe passes through this one town. And these are migrants from all of these countries: Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, you name it, Nigeria, Burkina Faso. And the reason Agadez has emerged as such a hub is because it's the first point where you actually need smuggler services. So all of these borders are actually wide open to anyone who holds a passport from one of these countries. There's an economic and political bloc called ECOWAS. So if you are from Ghana and you hold a Ghanaian passport, you can actually travel across any of these borders without a visa restriction. When you hit Agadez, though, you will need the service of a smuggler. First, so getting here is just a matter of taking a lot of buses. When you get to Agadez, however, you run into the Sahara Desert. And you need the service of a smuggler who can get you across the desert safely and also sneak you into Libya, where, in theory, there's border controls. So what we have is not just, we have this hub where, at its height in recent years, thousands of migrants were arriving daily, seeking the services of smugglers, paying between $150 and $300 per head to go from Agadez just to southern Libya. And the reason these smuggling networks emerged, like I said, is because of this demand where people here either are fleeing war or poverty and want to get to Italy. Now, because with so much money being made, and you can do some back of the envelope math here, let's say 50 trucks leave a week, each with 30 migrants inside of them, each paying about $200 each. We're already in the millions of dollars every week. So where there's an economy there, obviously all sorts of vested interests and actors are going to be involved. So we're not just talking about migrant smugglers. We're not just talking about the people putting guys in trucks and moving them. We're also talking about the hotel owners or shop owners who are selling SIM cards and selling goods to the migrants as they prepare for their journey. We're talking about property owners who've decided, well, if all these migrants are going to be here, I'm going to invest in maybe building some property that can house migrants as they prepare for their journey. We're talking about money changers and money lenders. Agadez didn't used to be a place where you could easily find an ATM that dispenses money. These days, it's quite easy. If you're in Agadez and you need to get your hands on a currency, you can find someone who is willing to provide that service. Demand for that type of service wasn't there, but now that migrants are coming through, it is there. So it's really shaped an entire economy. And the local authorities will tell you as much. They'll say, what incentives do we really have to stop this? One direct quote was, everybody's eating off of this, including the police. And in fact, along this main route, there are military outposts that just collect a rent off of the convoys going by. And so the country, that we're talking about here is Niger. Niger's own anti-corruption agency did a report in which they concluded that actually many of these military outposts wouldn't be able to afford their own fuel and their own provisions if it weren't for the skimming off the top of these migrant smuggling networks. So we're now talking about way more than just guys in trucks driving in the desert. We're talking about a political economy in which there are vested interests. And to actually tackle migrant smuggling would affect a whole lot of actors in a lot of different ways. And before getting to at the risk of getting into the weeds a little bit too much, there's one main sort of ethnic group that controls this route now, and they're called the Tubu. They're a marginalized community that lives in all three of these, that lives in Libya, Chad, and Niger. They're a minority in all of those countries. They feel like they're marginalized and kept out of formal economic and political channels. And so they're making a lot of money on migrant smuggling. And with this much money being made, that actually has political and economic repercussions. They've actually managed to get involved in some other activities that other groups have traditionally controlled. And so it's actually reshaping the ways in which various communities and tribes in this area interact with each other. and the way the government has to interact with them. Niger is a country that's often suffered from instability. It's in a neighborhood where instability is widespread. So northern Mali, we have an ongoing conflict. Southern Libya, we've got an ongoing conflict. Northern Nigeria, we've got an ongoing conflict. So Niger is actually trying very hard to maintain itself as a rare beacon of stability for now in that region. And one way the Nigerian government has done that is by reaching out to all sorts of various actors and placating them and working with them and allowing them to do all sorts of maybe partake in economic activity that may not be above board, but in exchange for not rebelling or in exchange for the alternative is them not having any livelihoods, and that can lead to some really negative repercussions. So I think part of what this illustrates is when we start thinking about the political economies of some of these hubs, is that for Europe right now is desperately trying to work with the Nigerians to crack down on the migrant smuggling here. They've encouraged them to pass an anti-smuggling law that's according to international standards. They want better border security. They want law enforcement to really crack down on the trade. But what incentives does Niger have to actually do that? If they're saying that, they're not saying this directly, but it's actually not, I don't think it's too provocative to wonder if actually migrant smuggling is a force for stability in Niger. Now it might be it might have negative repercussions elsewhere, but in this little pocket of the desert, it's actually where communities who otherwise feel marginalized derive their income and provide a service for people who need or want and in many cases need that service in order to reach safety. So that's the framing that I think we need to think about, and it's one that it can actually potentially translate to the work to this hemisphere, thinking about the ways in which certain smuggling hubs and communities, if you do deprive them of this revenue stream, then what are the possible negative repercussions? There might be positive repercussions as well, but you need to think about what your intervention is going, what will be the product of your intervention. And so I would like to leave time for Q&A. So I will just say that we see similar dynamics at work along these other hubs, and I'm happy later to talk about any of them if people have certain questions. But I think one thing that's very important to understand is in terms of developing a policy intervention, law enforcement and border controls can actually only go so far, because as I said, they might actually have the adverse repercussion of encouraging a further criminalization of the market and actually driving proceeds into the most criminal actors rather than kind of the low-level entrepreneurs who are just making a buck. I think one really way to illustrate it actually when Luigi was talking about the Balkan route, as he said, when these walls went up, organized crime moved in because they were the only people who could bypass these barriers, who had experience corrupting the right officials, moving other product through strict border controls. And actually, when that corridor was wide open or was actually barely policed, a lot of the people who were migrant smugglers were just guys who owned a farm near the border and said, I know a path that can get you the next leg. But when that wall goes up and the underlying demand to move, so refugee situations, people who feel like they're victims of global inequality and have no choice but to move, so long as the underlying demand is not addressed, then the only real effect you have is further criminalizing the market and also potentially putting migrants at greater risk and more vulnerable to exploitation because they have to take riskier journeys, interact with more criminal groups, and many of whom have a history of exploiting people for profit. So these are the things that I think it's important to think about when we decide what our intervention should be. Because it might be that if you think of it from the perspective of maybe first do no harm, or first let's not make the situation worse, the response might be something more akin to strategic patience, observing how these markets work, not really intervening just yet so that we can define where are actually the leverage points that would do the most good in actually disempowering the criminal groups, making it safer or easier for migrants to move, better border management. Um, the other sort of negative and I think risky policy that we're seeing Europe approach is, so there's what we have here, whereas that pressure to crack down on the migrant smuggling economy, and as I've warned, that could actually have some pretty negative security repercussions. This ethnic group, the Tubu, that's making a lot of money on this, if a crackdown does take place, well, they might get involved in other sorts of things, including maybe armed struggle, because they've got vested interests to protect. In East Africa, what we see are networks that, well, Europe is desperately seeking, again, partners to work with, to have better border security and better law enforcement. But what does that mean, practically speaking, here? Well, it means working with governments like Eritrea, a highly repressive state. The reason there are so many refugees from Eritrea is because they are escaping the state. So that's an imperfect partner to try to make a partnership with, to actually work with and maybe strengthen the very government that people are fleeing in the first place. And the other, another state that Europe is suddenly deciding it's got a little bit of appetite to work with is Sudan. Not that long ago, it was pretty much unthinkable that Europe would be offering aid packages to Sudan in exchange for better border security. And in fact, Sudan has decided, and many other states have decided, now refugees are a bargaining chip. Europe wants us to stop these flows, so we can use that actually to gain leverage in other components. And I think that's something that in the US, as we think about maybe how we engage some of our neighbors that are either transit countries or source countries, the risk of actually making migrants and refugees a bargaining chip, something to be leveraged, a tap that you can turn on and off in exchange for other concessions. And it's not a coincidence that one of the groups that's being used in Khartoum to actually secure this border and stopping migrants in the middle of the desert is a group called the Rapid Support Forces, which is previously known or went by the moniker of the Janjaweed. So the very group that the US and many of other actors have accused of genocide, a group that has a terrible human rights record. And so outsourcing the dirty work to them is not necessarily something we want to feel all that comfortable about, but it also means the actual commander of the RSF said to the press, he said, well, if Europe wants us to do this for them, they really ought to reconsider some of the sanctions they have against us. So we're already seeing migration, because we're securitizing the issue of migration, seeing it being used as a bargaining chip in international affairs. And I'm just not sure that's a road we necessarily want to go down, is further politicizing and securitizing an issue that actually at the heart of it is a policy problem, is really a matter of countries and states living up to their obligations under the Refugee Convention. So I know I've deviated a little bit from there. This overview that I have in the next slides is really an analysis of basically who are the key actors in each system, how prices are determined, the degrees of market consolidation, so the degrees to which it's a highly regulated market in which only a few actors are involved, or whether it's a very dispersed market. And that's something Luigi touched upon. He said in the flows he was talking about that it's a loose affiliation of actors who coalesce around an opportunity, who enter and exit the market very much. And as we've seen in these systems, I'm talking about the types of flows and the types of barriers that people need to overcome, the types of policies that smugglers are reacting to heavily shape the market and the market consolidation. And then the degrees in each of these, we went through the degrees of violence that are seen. So certain routes are more violent than others for a range of reasons. But I'll stop there so we have some time for Q&A. And I guess the last thing I think, and it's one that I think is actually directly translatable to maybe some of the trends we're seeing on our southern border, is that there's this big question of, in some ways, to what extent are we talking about kind of a loose alliance of freelancers, or are we talking about sophisticated organized crime networks? And there's actually a bit of a debate on that. When I talk to law enforcement officials in Africa and in Europe, it seems like there's a tendency to view it as actually a quite sophisticated migrant smuggling network operations that have hierarchies and resemble or organized crime syndicates akin to the mafia or drug trafficking that really have command and control centers in certain places. But when I talk to people on the ground who are either working in the NGO sector or migrants themselves or smugglers themselves, they tend to say, well, no, it's actually in a lot of ways a courier system. I move someone from one part of the border, from one step to the other, and then I hand them off to the next guy. And I think part of the reason there's that discrepancy is, well, one, the approach to analyzing these things, but two, if you, let's say, when Europe makes a big arrest of a kingpin, let's say based in Italy, who's Eritrean, and they see how they've been operating, there's a tendency maybe to impose structure backwards on a network. So when you're starting at the end of the pipeline and you see people and you look at how all this works, it can actually look like a very sophisticated, like highly organized structure that's funneling lots of people. But when you start on the back end, it actually looks like a group of people who just are working together a lot out of convenience, who don't really even know each other that well, who just kind of have seen an opportunity to collaborate and work together and to collectively, at the end of the day, provide a service that is a transnational crime and looks organized. So I think I'll just throw that out there as not a word of warning, but I think when you try to analyze these networks and figure out how they function, if you start at the end and backtrace it, it can look a lot like something that's highly organized, and then the policy response would be to crack down on this one network. And if you start in the beginning of it and try to analyze it on the way up, it looks like a different set of problems that will have a different set of policy prescriptions. So thanks again for your time, and very much looking forward to your questions.